Okay. Snehit, can we start? Okay. We started recording. Okay. So now we have Dr. Ekta Selarka. Is an associate professor at Madras School of Economics. Ma'am holds a bachelor degree in electrical engineering and a PhD in economics. She offers courses in financial economics, derivatives, market microstructure, and programming languages such as SAS. Prior to joining Madras School of Economics, worked as a research economist at IGDIR, IGIDR, Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and worked as research risk analyst with GE Capital. Research interests include corporate governance, ownership structure, capital market development, and gender diversity in the boardroom. She has published in international journals such as Journal of Corporate Finance, Emerging Market Trade and Finance, and Emerging Market Review. She was a recipient of Interval Fellowship 2018. She has received prestigious research grants from Indian Council of Social Science Research, ICSSR, and UK India Education and Research Initiative through collaborations with researchers in India as well as abroad. So we hope this session from Professor Ekta Selarka will be productive to all the participants here. So welcome, ma'am, to our platform. Welcome all participants. So over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Biju, for the introduction, and thank you to your department at the Kerala University for this opportunity to interact with the participants in AICT sponsored faculty development program on the topic of basic applied financial econometrics and business analytics. It's my pleasure to be here, and I hope that this session will be productive. So I am, as you can see in the programs, I have two sessions on the event study analysis. Today's session will be where I'll be covering most of the theoretical backgrounds, and in the next session, I will essentially discuss the application side of it by discussing the some of the seminal papers where the event study methodology has been used. So it will give you an overview of how to essentially apply it in using the data from the financial markets. So before that, we will cover the basic concepts that are required, and also I'll give you some basic references where you can get started with essentially implementing this methodology. Okay, so shall I start, Dr. Biju?
Yes, ma'am. We can start. No problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my slide is visible, I hope.
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, so I'm just going to make it a slideshow.
Oh.
Yeah, so it is in the full screen now, right? Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So just to start, we want to give an introduction. What is it about the event study? So we start with a formal definition. So what is the definition of event study is essentially this methodology attempts to measure the valuation effects of a corporate event, for example, merger or earnings management, by examining the response of the stock price around the announcement of the event. So as the name suggests, it is the event study, right? It is the study of how the stock price moves around a particular event. Okay. Now, when we conduct the event study, the underlying assumptions are basically threefold. So there are three important assumptions that we maintain in the event study. However, there are some adjustments that we might have to do while we are applying it and in the basic model, but I'll come to that shortly. Okay. But to begin with, this methodology requires three underlying assumptions. The first one is that the market processes all the information about the event in an efficient and unbiased manner. Second is this event is unanticipated. Okay, so this is a completely new information that comes in the market. And finally, the third assumption that there are no confounding effects during the event window. So event window is kind of pure. Okay, so there are no other effects that could also drive the movement in the stock price. Okay, because the you want to see the moment in the stock price, movement in all the stock price because of a particular event. So there should not be, should not mix up essentially the events around that window. Okay. So therefore, if we maintain these assumptions, we will be able to see the effect of a particular event on the stock prices. Okay. That's kind of the background of the event study. Now, graphically, this is how the price movement around the announcement date will be represented under the efficient market hypothesis. Okay, and I mean, because we are already in the finance domain, so I assume that all of us know what is the efficient market hypothesis. Is essentially, satisfying all the three forms of the efficient market hypothesis, that all the information is instantaneously incorporated into the stock price. Okay, that's essentially the efficient market hypothesis. So you can see that, so what is the x-axis is essentially the time period. It is usually measured in number of days. Okay, and the y-axis is essentially the stock price. Okay, so under the efficient market hypothesis, you know that what is the efficient movement in the stock price. Okay, so basically the equilibrium stock price, how it will move from one value to another value. So there is any jump, for example, in the stock price which is efficient would look like essentially a step function, right? So because of any particular event that occurs on day zero, right? So event study is the study around the event. So always the time period is expressed in before the event and after the event, because you want to track how the stock price has changed over the event window, right? So the event window consists of event days prior to event as well as after the event. So time t equals to 0 is essentially the day of the event. Okay, so any efficient change in the stock price would look like a step function. Okay, the one that you saw in the black step function form. Okay, other than that, now there could be possible that the market overreacts to the event. Okay, in that sense, you see how the overreaction would look like. So eventually, under the efficient market hypothesis, the price will come down to its efficient or the equilibrium level. Okay, but this event study, through the event study, we are able to capture that instantaneous reaction in the stock prices because of the event. Okay, so it could be possible that the market overreacts in the sense that the stock prices go, there is a spike in the stock price, and then it kind of achieves the new equilibrium price. Okay, at the same time, it could be overreaction. Okay, where you will see essentially the path of the stock price to its efficient, the new efficient value is through the red dotted line, right? So these are all possibilities. So this is just, so which one, depending on the reaction, we can capture whether the market is overreacting, underreacting, or the markets are in equilibrium. So basically the stock price jump is essentially, or change in stock price in general is as expected, okay, in the market. So any deviation from the expected change is essentially abnormal in the event study analysis. Okay. Now, so the effects of these the event on the firm valuation can be, these events can be within the firm's control, such as it could be an announcement of stock split or the dividend payment, right, or the earnings announcements. So these are all under firm's control. So where that means firm decides when to announce these events. Now, these events could be completely out of firm's control, okay, such as macroeconomic announcement about the interest rates that will affect deforms future operations in some or the other way, right? Or it could also be an external shock that would affect the firm's operations, but it is not necessarily in the control of the firm. Okay? So there are these two type of events, whether internal or external to the firm. Okay. Now, in the literature, various events that have been examined using the event study include mergers and acquisitions, earnings announcements, the issuance of the new debt or equity, announcements of macroeconomic variables such as interest rate, monetary policy changes, right? The IPO announcements, dividend payment announcements. These are, to name a few. Okay, these are very common set of studies which have explored the stock price reaction using the event study methodology. The event study technique is mainly used in corporate finance. So it has found a lot of interest in the corporate finance, not so much in economics generally. Okay, so simple technique. It looks like on the surface, at the face value, it is quite simple, but there are a lot of issues that a researcher needs to be aware of and take into account while conducting an event study analysis. An event study is not something very new, but it has a long history in finance literature and it is continuously evolving as well. Okay. So the very first paper where the event study analysis was introduced in the literature was essentially Fama-Fisher, Jensen and Rolls 1969 paper. This is a seminal paper. And it's a very simply written paper, a very, very simple way to explain the event study for using an announcement of the stock splits. Okay. And today we find thousands of papers using the event study method. So there are, with respect to event study, with respect to the earnings announcement, with respect to dividend announcement, with respect to the external shocks like crisis kind of announcement, mergers and acquisitions, so you name. And there are many, many, many papers around it. Okay. Now, this is also known as an event time analysis to differentiate it from the calendar time analysis. Okay, so this is essentially with respect to the event. So the difference from the time in general, which is the calendar time, is very important in the event study. Okay, so you see, if let me take you back to the diagram. So you can see that, you know, the presentation of event study is with respect to the event. So this day 0 is the event day. Okay, so the next day is not necessarily the calendar day, but it will be a trading day, the next trading day after the event. Okay, so suppose if the event occurs on Friday and Saturday the trading is not conducted, then we don't use Saturday and Sunday, but the next Monday would be day 1 actually for the market. So this is essentially, you know, the departure in the event study analysis. Okay, so these are the list of classic references. The lecture, the classroom lecture that we usually give is heavily based on essentially the book by Campbell Lowe and McKinley. Together they are known as CLM. That was written in 1997, The Econometrics of Financial Markets. It's a very famous book and it covers the issues related to event study and the econometrics behind it in a very extensive manner. Okay, so this is the classic textbook that we follow. There are seminal papers that also gives us a lot of information about the event study and the development of event study and that evolution of event study in general that we see so far. So you can go through these references. I'll share the list and some of the papers I'm referring to in my lecture today. So you will see as and when I cite those. Okay, and the other important reference is the last one, which provides the literature review on the event study. Okay, so especially the recent one, which is Kothari and Warner 2006 paper. Now, this is essentially talks about the literature review on the econometrics of event study. And that is published in the Handbook of Corporate Finance, especially with the focus on empirical corporate finance. So I highly recommend you this paper so that you will get an overall idea. After that, we don't have such an extensive literature review on the event study analysis, because they highlighted major problems, and then the non-parametric tests were essentially introduced. Okay. So very quickly, coming to the design of the event study, basically to cover up what are the steps to conduct an event study analysis. Okay. So the first one is defining an event. Second is the selection criteria. How do you essentially select the time period around the event? Third is measurement of normal returns and the abnormal returns, followed by the estimation procedure of the abnormal returns and the cumulative abnormal return. Once we have estimated, we will have to test the hypothesis using some standard tests like both parametric as well as non-parametric we will cover. Then present the empirical results and discuss those results by interpreting them in a correct manner. Okay. So this is the setup that we follow. Okay. This slide essentially shows the timeline for a typical event study when we design the event study. So this is part of the designing the event study. Okay. So it is all about the timing of the event and the time period around that event. So you can see that the timeline of an event study involves the event window, okay, and the day of the event. So event window is essentially the days around the event, and then it also includes the estimation window. Estimation window is a little bit larger, okay, which we use to predict the normal performance. So just look at the diagram. Tau is our timeline. Tau equals to 0 is the event day, okay. Around the event, you can decide whether you want to, look for stock price reaction for say 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 10 days, 20 days. So that describes the event window T1 and T2. So these are typically, it is plus and minus. So if I'm looking for 5 days before the event, then I will look for 5 days after the event. So event window is usually symmetric in nature, okay, because you want to kind of have a proper idea about it. So tau, which is greater than T1, and it can reach up to T2, is the event window. Then comes essentially the interval, which is T0 minus T1. Okay, so going back further from T1 in time before the event is the estimation window. Okay. Now, similar to the estimation window, after the event window is over, there is a post-event window, which is the time period T2 minus T3. Okay, so T2 to T3 is essentially the post-event window. Okay, so from 0 to T2, you have the event window. From T2 to T3, you will have the post-event window. Okay. Similarly, on the time period before the event, from tau equals to 0 to T1, you have an event window. The time period between T1 and T0 is essentially the estimation window. And there is often, these are not necessarily continuous, there's often a gap between the estimation and event periods, because we don't want to kind of, the whole idea is that the market should not anticipate these events. So if we have to rule out, so any anticipation has to be taken into account when we are predicting the normal performance without any event in the picture.
Ma'am, ma'am, can I interrupt here?
Yes, please.
Can we take this COVID-19 as an event and do a study related to that?
Yes, you can. Absolutely.
So in that case, what would be the event window and what would be the pre-event window and post-event, like estimation window and post-event?
Yes. So now this one is tricky, right? So
Yes.
if you are saying, see, the beauty of event study is you can see the effect of the COVID, but the problem with COVID is it's, it is such a
Not yet
large
over.
shock. It is such a large shock that, can you say that the markets have come down to its equilibrium position? We cannot say it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
So the event study that we are talking about, now you will have, after the COVID is over, there are some long horizon event studies as well. Okay. I will come to that, but it has its own issues. But this setup is very much applicable into essentially, where there is and kind of, there is a very short term effect on the stock prices, okay, which we are able to use to capture, to understand that how the market is thinking about this particular event, okay,
Okay.
and not really a long term. So long term effects are anyway you can see in a normal econometric setup of the COVID, right?
Okay.
Now, related to COVID, if you have a particular announcement, so you can actually do an event study where you are already in the COVID period, okay?
Yes,
So
ma'am.
things are pretty much kind of, the new normal in terms of the COVID, but it is not the normal as it should have been, but it is somewhat in a disturbance period. But how the stock prices of, say, pharmaceutical forms have changed, okay, when there is a particular announcement related that would have affected a particular industry or a particular set of forms, for example, you understand? So
Yes.
that is, and similarly, you can within the COVID time period in finance, what you can do is you can take up the announcement when the essentially the Ministry of Finance announced that there will be a loan moratorium, right? So the RBI announced it, and then that was applicable. Then you can say that how it affected, right? How it affected essentially the NPAs or the stocks of the banks, because ultimately, it would have affected the it would have delayed essentially, the reporting of the bad loans and stuff like that. So within the COVID window, you can study the effect of a particular announcement. Now, COVID is not an announcement. You see,
Yes. Yes.
COVID is a shock
Yeah.
that comes to the market. Financial crisis of 2008 was a shock in the market.
Yes.
After an external shock, the markets itself will have a new normal, right? So naturally, you will see a lot of disturbance, but it's not a clean possibility in that sense because all the forms are affected. So it will be very difficult for you to point out, to separate the reaction in the stock price, you know, for essentially with respect to something which can be managed at the form level.
Yeah. We
Right.
cannot attribute it to that particular.
Yes, yes. Because, if I take the crisis, it has affected all the firms. So I will
Yes.
immediately ask you a question. So what, right? So everybody, yeah, I'm likely to see an abnormal return. Markets were really depressed about it. So everybody reacted in a very pessimistic way. Yeah. But what's the kind of, use of that,
Yeah.
right? So that's where the event studies mostly, the one-time event.
Oh.
Okay, not the
Yes.
shock per se. With respect to shocks, there are standard econometric models which you can actually use. That would be more interesting. Understand?
Oh.
But within
Okay.
COVID, yes, whenever there is an announcement, okay. So the
Yeah.
event here is a particular announcement that is, that is perceived to have an effect on say a stock price of a particular firm or a particular set of firms or a particular industry. All these are possible. Okay, but it's more like around the announcement that is completely external for the market, right? So now that's essentially the point. Okay, but whereas I can have a long run study where I see that overall risk in the market has increased because of the COVID. Yeah, that's a kind of that is not necessarily an event study analysis. That is more more conventional econometric financial econometric study. Okay,
Okay,
compared
thank you.
to the pre-COVID period. Yes, thank you.
Actually, ma'am,
Yes.
then how to decide this estimation period and the post-event window and event review?
Yeah, that's why I'm coming to that. Yes,
Okay,
I'm coming to that. But I'm just telling you that these are the elements in the designing of the event study. Now we will decide how to choose, okay? How to choose these window. So I can tell you that, time t equals to 0 is the event day, right? Now, mostly in the literature, we want to, this is all instantaneous, right? Markets are very quick. So you cannot say that my event window has to be, say 3 months, 4 months, 1 year after the event. No, that doesn't make sense because markets learn very quickly. And the price reactions kind of come back to the new normal quite instantaneously because remember the assumption that the markets are efficient, right? So the typical event window is essentially, yeah. So I can see some of the messages, but I'm just a little bit distracted. So I'm just kind of, I would like if you can ask the question, or I can take those questions if you are typing probably at the end, right? So I think that would work for all of us. But yes, you can interrupt me and ask a question.
Ma'am, can I
Yes.
ask a question? Ma'am,
Yeah,
in
let me just finish, Shantanu. Let me just
okay,
finish
okay.
the responding to the earlier question, and I'll come to that. Okay, so typically the event window is selected as 1 day before and after, 2 days before and after, 5 days before and after, or maximum 10 days before and after. A typical length of the estimation window is if you are conducting any standard econometric data analysis, because you need to satisfy the law of large numbers, a typical estimation window has to be more than 30 days. Okay, so typically we select the estimation window which is around 150 days to 200 days. Okay, and the post event window can be another 10 or 15 days, like that. Okay, so that's essentially the structure that we follow, and it kind of these numbers are kind of flexible, but not, you cannot reduce the estimation window by just taking 10 days of observation. These are all daily data, right? So what happened to the stock price before the before say 10 days before the event, it doesn't make sense. You have to actually see, you have to have a the normalcy in the market to predict that performance. So typically 150 to 200 days, nearly 1 year of the trading prices is a good estimation window that we should consider. Yes, Shantanu.
Hello, ma'am.
Hmm.
Ma'am, basically you wanted to say that any macroeconomic variable, if we consider, generally event study is not concerned of any macroeconomic variable, isn't that? Like if
No, you can have a macroeconomic variable. Of course, you can have a macroeconomic variable, which is like announcement about, say, if RBI announces a change in the monetary policy, right? So that would affect the bank stocks. So yes, you can actually conduct an event study analysis around the macroeconomic variable as well.
but ma'am, when suppose if RBI announces any monetary policy, if any case, now the disequilibrium we can watch that the data is going down or something, but how would we knowing that again it will reach the equilibrium?
See, what you're talking about is just look at this diagram, right? So there could be any new equilibrium. We are not concerned about that. Okay, we are only concerned about essentially the immediate reaction in the stock price. in the event study analysis. So how they achieve that equilibrium, okay, through the overreaction, through the underreaction, or without any reaction. That's the point.
Okay, may basically concerned of that particular fluctuation
Yes.
in
So
that point of at that announcement.
yeah, so that fluctuation is essentially the market reaction, right? So if the market is likely to overreact, then how soon, then we can actually see how soon it comes down to, the normalcy, right? Where you will not see any kind of deviation from the normal scenario. So that reaction is very important. Um, for essentially the event study. So let me just kind of give you a more detail about it, and then we can have a solid discussion around it, because I think a lot of things will be covered as I progress further. You will see actually how the model looks like, then it will help you further to kind of appreciate it, right? So I think but any clarificatory questions are welcomed during the session. Okay. Yeah. Now, once I designed the timeline, there are many issues with the timeline that we need to keep in mind. And some of that I've already answered. Okay. First is definition of event. We need to be extremely careful about what we define an event is. Okay. It has to be an unexpected event. If it is expected, then the stock price have already internalized that information. Correct? So I cannot say that the stock price change or the reaction has happened because of a particular event. So it has to be unanticipated event. Okay, you have to make sure that the event is unanticipated, and also exact point in time when the event is announced. So that date is very important. It cannot be that it would have been announced on the one day before or one day after, in the evening after the markets are closed. Nothing like that. Okay, so you have to be absolutely sure when the event was announced. It's very important, very crucial for the event study. The second one is the frequency of the event study. Okay. We need to, under this, we need to decide that how fast the information is incorporated into the price. So we cannot really look at the yearly return. So I cannot say that, the Companies Act was announced or was implemented from, say, 1st April 2014, right? And then I'm seeing that, after what happens after 1 year of the Companies Act. So this kind of a setup, the event study is not fit, because all we are talking about the instantaneous incorporation of the information in the stock market. Okay, so we cannot look at the yearly return. We cannot even look at the 10 seconds return at the same time. Okay, so the 10-second return is a highly volatile time period at the same time. So there could be a lot of other things. So you need to kind of, the market has to learn the information, and then market has to kind of, the market has to absorb that information, and then kind of prices have to react. Okay, so people usually look at the daily, weekly, or at the max monthly return. So the frequency cannot be a very long frequency, and neither it can be a high frequency. So usually we do not have event study analysis using a high frequency data. So that's something that we must practice with caution. Okay. Third is the selection of the sample. We need to decide what is the sample of companies that we want to consider, right? So this will be decided with respect to what event that you are going to study. So it may not necessarily, it may affect all the forms. Okay. So when you drop or add forms, you have to be absolutely sure that why these forms are selected. So there's just like any econometric study, the sample selection has to be, unbiased in that sense. So if I'm looking at the earnings announcement, then I should have all the forms, because every firm would have announced their earnings, right? So every firm needs to announce their audited results. So that is kind of, then I cannot say that I'm only dealing with a few set of forms and not all the forms. Whereas some events like stock split and all, not every firm is going to announce the stock split. Only selected firms would have announced the stock split. Then you kind of take those samples and compare the performance with respect to the non-stock split firm. So that kind of the designing has to be very important. Okay. Then finally, the horizon of the event study is very important when it comes to the timeline. If the markets are efficient, then we should consider the short horizons, that is few days around the event. Okay. People have looked at the long horizon studies. Okay. They have its own applications. I'll come to that and present what are the long horizon studies and why they have been conducted. But usually, because event study is the main assumption in the event study is the efficiency of the market, short horizon event studies are more popular than the long ones. Okay. So the event study, when you read the literature, can be categorized by the horizon. Short horizon event studies are essentially, take into account from 1 month before the event to 1 month after the event. So up to 30 days. That's all. Whereas long horizons, they go up to 5 years after the event. Suppose there is like these are kind of the events which are perceived to have really a long-term effect on the firm stock price, then it is essentially the long horizon studies. There are very few long horizon studies that go up to the 5 years of the event. Okay. Now, these studies are based on different horizons, have totally different goals for them to conduct the event study. Short horizon studies is essentially the main goal is there to understand how quickly the information is incorporated into the stock prices. Whereas long horizon studies, okay, they are conducted basically based on the arguments about the inefficiencies in the return or for different expected return, okay, or maybe a combination of the inefficiency in the market. Okay, so it is rather the long horizon studies, in other words, is not about the information incorporation into the prices, but it is more of a test for the market efficiency rather than, the essentially the way the prices are incorporating the new information. Okay, how quickly the market is essentially incorporating the information, the prices are incorporating the information, right? So, or some confusing combination of both the market efficiency or essentially, the change in the equilibrium. We talked about that, if there is a permanent shift in the equilibrium after an external shock, then the long horizon studies actually are used to study that. But it becomes confusing because, there is a whole argument of the market efficiency as well. So the markets can become temporarily inefficient, actually, following the crash in the market, right? So there is a lot of kind of debate around it. So, but the goal is different. So the point is that you have to be clear what is your objective to conduct an event study. So, for example, there was a question about a COVID, and you say that we want to conduct a long horizon study, then you will have to work hard to justify essentially that why that long horizon study makes sense, because then you will end up arguing about the market efficiency because there is a kind of there is a permanent change in the way market behaves, right? So what is that new normal against that you are actually observing the reaction? So that becomes confusing. Okay, so for that reason, people usually use the short horizon studies when they conduct the event study analysis, and the maximum efficiency with respect to the event study methodology as a tool is obtained when there's a short horizon. Okay. So am I going according to the time, or am I going too slow, too fast? Can we take a stock of the time? Somebody, Dr. Biju?
Yeah, we have time till 6 o'clock,
Yeah,
4:30,
yes.
6. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So I'm
we can wind up 6:15. Then we will have discussions 6:10 or
yeah.
6:10 time. Then we will have discussions for after that. Then 6:30 we can come.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just be more focused. Yeah, so that we get more time for discussions. Okay. Yeah. So now, the once we have understood the timeline and the nature of the study that we want to conduct, there are certain models how to measure the normal performance. What is the normal performance of the returns that we should start with? So any deviation from the normal performance is abnormal, right? And you want to see how long this abnormality stays in the market. So how long, how fast the abnormality vanishes from the market. Okay. So what we do is essentially, so just a little bit of econometrics here. So we can always decompose a return in the form of the expected return and the error term, right? Which is the pure random deviation in the return that you would have expected, right? Now, this expected return is the normal return, right? So now this conditioning is happening on the information. So expected return given the information at that point in time, right? And then there is a new information. So this is perfectly all right because you want to know the normal return based on the window which is free of that event, right? So there is no new information in the market, and then you are able to, you are able to predict the return. So that is what the essentially the expected term is about. Okay, and eta is essentially the information we indicate the information in the finance literature, and epsilon is essentially the random component. It could be any, like the business cycles and stuff like that, right? So anything which is random, that is essentially, or it is also the idiosyncratic component with respect to the firm. Okay, so suppose the CEO leaves or CEO has been fired, those things will sit and will reflect into the error term, right? So not in the expected return. Okay, so the information is essentially that term. So that epsilon is very important. So any effect on of the event has to appear in the error term, right? So for example, a sacking of a CEO is an event, right? It is a very much an event, and which should have an effect on the essentially the return of these return generated from the stocks, right? So stock prices in general. So that will go and sit in the error term. Okay, so this error term in the event studies is called the abnormal return. So any deviation from, so RIT is the observed return, and the first term is the expected return. So epsilon is essentially the observed return minus the expected return, right? So these are called essentially the abnormal return. If there is no event, then the expected value, if I take the expectation of this entire thing, then the expected value of error term has to be 0. Correct? Because if the form has, anything, it could have a positive effect and it gets cancelled over a period of time, right? So the average value of error should be 0. That's a standard way we know, because markets are efficient, right? Now, why it is called the abnormal return? Because it is assumed that any unexplained part in the return expression is due to some abnormality, right, which is arising due to an event which is not at all captured in that model of the returns, right? So in a sense, we want to essentially, get close to a natural experiment, right? Then this event is purely exogenous because it is not all anticipated, so that it can actually affect the expected value of the return. So this is unanticipated shock that affects some of the stocks, some of the firms, right? So if the CEO has been fired, then not all the firms have fired the CEO, but you will have a sample where of firms where the CEOs have left, right? Have been asked to leave, like that. So it is an anticipated event. When in that sense, it has to be a pure exogenous shock that comes, which is not incorporated already in the return model. So we want to compare the returns of these stocks who have experienced the event after the announcement, so around the announcement, compared to the others who are not affected by the event. Okay, so that's an ideal event study analysis. Okay, so you have the entire sample, and then you actually look at the abnormal return of the stocks which are affected by the event, and compare them with respect to the returns, okay, normal returns for the other firms who are not affected. And any difference, if it is significant, then you know there is an effect of the event itself because the other firms are not affected. So
Excuse me,
that's kind
ma'am.
of
Ma'am, because I have a mistake. Actually, we will have time only up to 6 o'clock. So 5:45 we can wind up the session and session
yeah.
will be for the discussion. Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Okay. Done. Yeah, definitely. So it's 5:21. I have nearly 20 minutes. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. So essentially that's the abnormal return, and I can take it up in the next class when I start. That's okay. So yeah. So normal returns are essentially, so once we have understood that what is that abnormality, all we have to do is we need to find a normal return, right? We need to estimate the normal return. Okay, so we need a control group, okay, because it's an experiment. So you know the treatment group are basically the firms which have experienced a particular event. Then we need a benchmark group, okay, against which we will judge the impact of the essentially the event on the returns. Okay, so there's a huge literature how to predict the normal returns. Now you can say that my standard financial literature tells me that the capital asset pricing model predicts the equilibrium expected return, okay, or the arbitrage pricing theory. You can use that, okay, but it is absolutely not clear because there are some issues with the CAPM and APT, right? So we all know that. So this is precisely essentially what we need to do in terms of the event study. So we need to specify the expected return, which we call the normal return from this expression. So the expected term is what we focus on. That is called the normal return. Okay. Now, if we are looking at the short horizon studies, then we can assume that the expected return need not change over a period of time. So that's perfectly all right. If we are looking at the long horizon studies, then we know that those expected return, that because the equilibrium can change, right, on a very long horizon. So that can be a big problem, right? So then how do we perceive this expected return is a problem. So we need to be careful. So usually, a lot of errors happen in the long horizon study. So there is no easy way out of this problem. So short term, to begin with, we will stick to the short term event studies. Now, what are the models that we use for normal return? Are we using, so there are statistical models as well as there are economic models. Now, in the event study, you can go through the slides, okay? So there are essentially economic models like capital asset pricing model and arbitrage pricing models, whereas there are purely statistical models like the constant mean return model or the market model. Okay, so if normality is the assumption that we follow in terms of the return, which is a very common assumption, then we need not worry about essentially a difference between the statistical and economic models. Because in the event study, the literature, people do not really care about whether the correct economic model has been used, because the economic models are mostly used to describe the equilibrium situation. So the CAPM has a different goal compared to just predicting the normal returns. So for that, we can stick to the statistical models. Okay. Now, one point is essentially there seems to be, that is indicated in the textbook, that because economic models have lot of restrictions in terms of assumptions, and the event study, we have only very limited set of assumptions. We want to be kind of flexible as possible. There is no apparently clear reason for us to use the economic model, and statistical models are mostly used in the event study. Okay, and among the statistical models, two are most famous: constant mean return model and the market model. So we mostly use the market model, right? And then we can do it. So some of the studies, so I'll describe both the models for the time being. Constant mean return model is essentially for every asset I, the constant mean return model assumes that the asset returns are given by essentially the expected value plus the epsilon, where the expected value is constant, okay, which you can estimate over a period of time. Right? So the paper by Brown and Warner essentially find that the simple mean returns model, which is the constant mean return model, often yield similar result to those of a very sophisticated set of models because the variance of the abnormal return is not reduced much by choosing a more sophisticated model. So constant mean return model is perfectly all right. So this mu is a constant which is calculated using a historical data. Okay. So little bit of more variation is possible when we use the market model, right? So we know from the literature that every stock is a part of certain market, right? So in a larger scale, every stock is a part of a stock exchange, which is a market, but they are part of their own focus group, like banking stocks are part of the banking industry in general, right? So there exists a market. So we need to control for the movement in the market also. So that's where the most popular model in practice is the market model. And the market model describes the asset return, right, as follows. So in the market model, the expected return is essentially alpha I plus beta I times RMT, okay, where RMT is the expected return from the market. And here, the market can be proxied as the index. Okay, so for the banking stock, you can take the banking index. For the top stocks, right, the liquid stocks, you can take the Nifty as the market index. So it is all okay in that sense. So you can have a proxy for the market. So in this model, essentially, once you control for the market return, right? So it's a return on the market portfolio, which can be Nifty or Nifty Junior or NSE 100. Everything is possible. Okay, or Sensex in general, which is the index for the Bombay Stock Exchange. So this describes a linear specification, okay, to predict the returns using a market model. Okay. So usually, as I said, that these indices are available. So when beta equals to 0, then the market model collapses into essentially the constant mean return model. Okay, so you can play around with it. So, but this has to be estimated at every form. Okay. So once you estimate, then you have to keep a watch on the R square and all. So here, because you are estimating compared to the constant mean, you can pay attention to the R square also. So the R square indicates the power of the essentially the regression. Okay, so that's it. So usually I'll skip this part. These are the other models. You can go through that involves the CAPM, standard capital asset pricing model, and the Fama-French three-factor model. So these are another set of models that people use to essentially predict the expected return or the normal return. Okay, and then everything becomes easy afterwards, because then you have to just take the difference from the observed return. Okay.
Ma'am, 1 minute back, please, ma'am. One query, ma'am, please.
Yes.
Hello? Ma'am,
Yes.
back to the previous slide, sometimes we use that SML and HML. That sometimes when we talk, takes the stocks as a whole, or will take the stocks. Suppose we are taking the banking stocks of 20 stocks, we can take the SML or HML of that 20 stocks, or across the industry as a whole, or across the companies as a whole.
Oh, so you are directing the question on the Fama-French three-factor
Yes.
model.
Yes.
Yeah. So what happens is, the SML is essentially return on the size portfolio minus, so the relative size portfolio. So within that industry, you will actually create a portfolio of the large stocks versus a small stocks, and then take the difference. That's SML factor. Okay. So your industry has to be focused. So if it is a banking industry, then you will actually calculate this factor within, because the portfolio has to be created in the same industry. So you will actually calculate it in the same industry. Now, the other point is the Fama-French three-factor model. Based on the three-factor model, they have estimated across different industries themselves. So in Stata, okay, you will see a module on the Fama-French three-factor model. So you can actually had the Fama-French model for the banking industry also. So there they have already kind of, given the factors, right? So you can apply that using your own portfolio and then kind of, reiterate it. So, but the point is, it has to be within the same industry. So this has to be run in the same industry. Within the same industry, you have to kind of, these portfolios are dynamic portfolios. So it is IT, right? So for I stands for the expected return, whereas the subscript in SML and HML, you see that it is T, right? So it is dynamic for a firm, but it is dynamic for all the firms, using all the firms in that industry. Okay, so in that market. So this is the definition is very important. So the portfolio has to be focused here, right? So you have to use the
sometimes
industry.
if I go to that already there is, if you have talked about CMI progress data, they've already calculated that SML and HML data of the companies across company of Indian industry. Let's take
Yes.
500 companies. So we can take that data. There is no problem.
You can take that also, because then it will be essentially, you will place your study with respect to the entire universe of the forms. And
Yeah.
then you say that the value factor as well as the size factor when it comes to the entire market. So that is the interpretation. Yeah.
Okay. Correct.
Okay. So the null hypothesis in the event study is that the event that we are considering has no impact on the behavior of return distribution. So the moment we see any abnormality in the return distribution, we say that the null hypothesis is rejected. Okay. Now, how do we do that? What are the underlying statistics? They are all straightforward now. Okay. I'll just give the expressions and I'll take you to the essentially the plots and to complete the theoretical discussion. Okay. Before we go to the practical discussion. Okay. So estimation of abnormal return using a market model, you can say that essentially the hat indicates the estimated value. So which is essentially the RIT minus expected RIT, right? So which is alpha I hat minus beta I hat times RMT, okay? Now the variance of this abnormal return is calculated like this, where L1 is essentially the entire estimation is happening. So this, when you see RI tau here, this tau is the estimation window, okay? It does not include the event window. So this normal estimation has to happen on the estimation window. Okay, you have to keep the event window separate. And then using this, you will predict it for the event window. Okay, so this is essentially L1, which is the sample length. Okay, number of observation in the sample is the length of the estimation window. So if you are using 150 days of the trading data, then it is 150. If you are using 200 days, then it is essentially 200, like that. Okay. Now, here is the starting point is very important. So L1 is the length of the estimation window, but the estimation window should start from, suppose my event window is 0, right? 0 to say -2. Then typically the estimation window will start from -20 to minus, add 100 days or 150 days into it, it will come to -170. Okay, like that. So you should have a gap in between. That is the estimation window. And with the normality assumption in the financial markets, we know that the abnormal return will follow a normal distribution with mean 0. These are all standard normal, right? So these are normal return. So it will have an average value as 0, right? With the variance given by sigma square. Now, once you have the variance, right, and you can actually calculate the statistics, but what we do is essentially, so this abnormal return is estimated on every day, right? Now we accumulate them to draw the overall inferences, which is called the cumulative abnormal return. Now this accumulation happens over the event window. So this CAR tau 1, tau 2 is essentially here, tau 1, tau 2 are the event window. So it can be, minus 2 to plus 2, which is the summation of the abnormal return from tau equals to tau 1 to tau 2. Okay, so what you're doing is you are estimating the abnormal return, right, using the estimation window. Then whatever you have predicted, the essentially the normal return using the estimation window, sorry. So estimation window is used to estimate the expected return. You apply that expected return from the estimation window to calculate the abnormal return on each day of the event window. Okay, then accumulate them and calculate the cumulative abnormal return. It's a simple sum. You see, it's a simple sum of day 1 abnormal return, day 2 abnormal return, day 3 abnormal return. If your event window is of 5 days, okay, or say 6 days, right? So basically 5 days means plus 2 minus 2, right? So if it is 5 days, then the cumulative abnormal return would be abnormal return of minus 2, abnormal return on minus 1, abnormal return on 0, abnormal return on plus 1, abnormal return on plus 2. Okay, so that's essentially the cumulative abnormal return. And as you can see, if your estimation window size increases, right, your cumulative abnormal, your variance is essentially, the variance will essentially be close to the error variance, and the cumulative abnormal return will also follow the normal distribution. So it is kind of, it is useful that we essentially have a large enough estimation window. Okay. Now, there are certain the cumulative abnormal returns that we aggregate over the event window as well as across the events. Okay, so there is the one measure is the average abnormal return, which is nothing but the average of the abnormal return in the event window, which is the first expression. The second expression is you take the average of the cumulative abnormal return itself. So that is essentially the summation of the average abnormal returns. So either you accumulate the abnormal returns, or you essentially take the average of the accumulated abnormal returns. Okay. In this framework, we have to be careful that there is no overlap between the event windows. So there should not be multiple events. Okay. So your event window has to be very well defined from tau equals to tau 1 to tau 2. Okay. There should not be any overlapping between these. Otherwise, these accumulation are not economically meaningful. Okay. Now, alternatively, we can calculate the average of cumulative abnormal return. Once we have the cumulative abnormal return and the average and the variance, we can actually calculate the statistic based on the cumulative abnormal average cumulative abnormal return, which is a standard, which can be used as a standard T statistics. It follows a standard normal distribution. So any T test will be applied to essentially check for the significance. It's a standard normal variable, so any t-test will be applied to check for the significance of theta 1. Okay, these are all standard methods. So this is all parametric test. Okay, so your theta 1, which follows a standard normal distribution, you apply the t-test, it's a standard parametric test. Okay, now there are non-parametric tests because of the non-synchronous trading in the market. Not all the stocks are frequently traded. So there are a couple of non-parametric tests that people have suggested, which involves rank test and the sign test. Okay, the expressions are given to you. And these are all standard tests available in Stata. So Stata has a module on the event study. So you will see that these tests are all available in that module. Okay. Now, this is how the analysis of the abnormal return looks like. So I have included two examples. So one is where the announcement was the approval of FDAs, okay, and the second one is more form specific announcement when the firms announce special dividends, and not just the dividend, but if there are some special dividend, intermediate dividends announcements. Yes.
Ma'am, I want to interrupt once again.
Hmm.
You said that if it is conforming to normality, we should be using T statistic, ma'am. Here, I think dependent samples T should be used, isn't it? Or independent T should be used.
Where? Here.
Yes, ma'am. You said, Narjit, that the hypothesis is to be rejected or accepted based on T statistic because it follows the T distribution. Then,
Normal,
ma'am,
standard normal distribution. Yeah.
standard normal distribution, ma'am. Which T to be used? Dependent samples T or independent samples T?
No, these are part of the same sample. So it is actually the same sample T that you have to use.
Dependent samples T test.
Yeah. So everything is happening on the same sample, right? So
Same.
now once you do, see, that is where the sample selection will come. Now, if this exercise you are doing between the control sample and the treatment sample, so there is a sample of forms which are actually going through the event, then there are sample of forms which are which are not going to, which are not affected by the event, but then you are calculating the essentially the cumulative abnormal return around the same event, right? Then they are independent samples.
Independent samples.
But if you use only the sample of forms which are affected by the events, and it is a dependent sample, and you will test for the significance from difference from zero itself. That's all.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Otherwise, you will compare the statistic between these two samples. Depends on you. Okay, so this is just a graphical representation. What you see is, this is kind of the x-axis is essentially the abnormal return on around the event, right? So t equals to 0 is there is a spike, you see. So before the event, so it covers the event window up to 21 days before and after. Okay, so this is kind of max you can go up to 30 days. In this example, you can see that what is the effect of this event on the sample of firms which were affected by this particular FDA approval and who announced a special dividend. So this is you can clearly see that there is, in this case, the stock price reaction is higher than the expected, okay, following the announcements. Now, naturally, you can relate it with the corporate finance literature that these are beneficial for the firms. So stock market reacts in a positive way, right? So this is how once you calculate the abnormal return, and this is a simple plot of return, right? And event study involves a graphical representation as well as followed by essentially the testing of the hypothesis using the test statistics. But graphically also it is very appealing because you can clearly tell a story based on the graph itself. Okay, so these are some examples. I have a lot of other graphs also, but before we kind of how much time I have, yeah, so I'm almost kind of I have 1 minute left, so I'll just very quickly discuss essentially there are certain studies, recent studies, which use essentially buy and hold abnormal return rather than using the abnormal return that I described in last few slides. And why they use the buy and hold abnormal returns rather than the abnormal returns? Because it is argued by these economists that the cumulative abnormal returns are statistically okay, but they are not very meaningful economically, right? So the Barber and Lyons paper in 1997, they suggested the buy and hold abnormal return as essentially a good alternative to the cumulative abnormal return. Okay, and the buy and hold abnormal returns are essentially defined as, given the AR, right, abnormal return, they are defined as essentially the next expression, as you can see in the slide. Now, what is the difference between the buy and hold abnormal returns and the cumulative abnormal return? Cumulative abnormal return is simply an arithmetic expression using the abnormal return, whereas buy and hold abnormal returns are essentially the geometric expression. And this makes sense because people in the essentially the investors in the market, they are not kind of doing this in a simple arithmetic way, right? It is more of a to take care of the compounding effects and all. Then it is more of they are actually buying the stocks, they are holding the stocks, and then deciding it. So it is the geometric expressions make more sense, more economic sense than a simple arithmetic expression. Okay, so
Ma'am, can we define the sign, please? The var, what is the product? It is the product of 1 plus the
product,
abnormal.
yes, it is a
The
product.
multiplications of that.
Yeah. It is a product over a period of time, which is indicated as K. So that is nothing but the event window. That's all. Okay. So it's instead of CAR is essentially the arithmetic sum, right? CAR is simply the sum of ARs, and buy and hold is a product of 1 plus AR. So it takes into account essentially because abnormal return is the discounting. It's kind of a discounting factor, right? So for it's a discounting factor, and then you kind of multiply it over a period of time. So it takes into account the compounding effect rather than simple arithmetic. So it's that kind of a difference, which is more meaningful economically in the financial markets, right? So any return is essentially grows over a period of time, let's say, right? So you don't really add them in a arithmetic sense. So similar to everything else remains same, right? So the only difference is between how you calculate CAR versus the buy and hold abnormal returns, and everything that follows remains absolutely same. So you can also aggregate the buy and hold abnormal returns. Okay, and because of the same reasons, the variance of the buy and hold abnormal returns will be less than the variance in the cumulative abnormal returns. So this is a kind of economically strong measure that people have suggested in the event study. Okay, this is how essentially the another event study across different kind of announcements. This is all just to give you, what are the announcements. You can clearly see acquisition, alliances, corporate restructuring, expansion, board changes, directors dealing, earnings releases, any updates in the rating. So these are essentially this diagram shows, these are from various studies. Then they have conducted the event study, and you can clearly see that the studies have largely found a very high, significantly negative effect with respect to abnormal returns, with respect to essentially when directors are involved in the, say, insider trading or something like that, right? So mostly this is the minus 0.36 that you see is essentially the studies which have used the insider trading by the directors. Okay, naturally that's a negative. You expect the markets to react negatively, so that's obvious. So that validates essentially the logic of the director dealing. Okay, so this is another graph. I'll skip this in the interest of time, but this is all graphical representation. So you can see that any event study has to be described, essentially the days around the event, before the event, as well as after the event. Okay, so the essentially the red one around it is kind of the confidence interval, and the black one is the actual abnormal return. Okay, so this is comparison between which one to use, the buy and hold abnormal returns or the cumulative abnormal returns. For short horizons, there are not much differences between buy and hold and cumulative abnormal return, but for long horizons, people have recommended that the buy and hold abnormal returns are more better conceptually compared to the cumulative abnormal returns. For the short term, it's fairly okay to use even the cumulative abnormal. Okay, if you cannot have the buy and hold abnormal return. So this is, as I told you, this is a testing that you can actually calculate the T statistic, which is the traditional T statistic, which is essentially the average value of CAR divided by the standard deviation, the sample standard deviation, and using essentially the standard, applying because if your sample size is large enough, following the central limit theorem, standard normal is used for both the tests. Okay, so if your T statistic is significant, you reject the null hypothesis that the event has no impact on the returns. Okay. Yeah, and then as I said that these are the non-parametric tests, which includes essentially the sign test and the rank test. You can go through that. Okay. Now I have some slides which I can always cover in the next class. Now these are the issues essentially with the, with the econometric issues. Okay. About the misspecification as well as the sample, which itself is a non-random sample. So you will essentially, not be able to satisfy the normal assumption property. Okay. Then you have to be careful about. So it is very important that the sample that is chosen is essentially it has to be a random sample in that sense. Okay. Now, there are other issues that there could be multiple events, so there has to be event clustering that has to be taken into account, and or this could be event study could be a joint test of market efficiency as well as the effect of the event. Okay, and the other one is, as we covered, that there could be long horizon studies which have all sorts of issues about the interpretation and all, right? So this is how you take care of event clustering standard methods. Okay, these are all, if you see that you have an issue of the event clustering, then you have to take care of the interdependence between the abnormal returns, and this is simple adjustment that we do in terms of the variance, so that our t statistic is a modified t statistic in that sense, after taking into account the clustering standard ways that we do. Okay, now very quickly I will essentially skip all these. Okay, so these are the diagrams you see. These are various papers. We will discuss all these papers in the next class, how to do this for a practical approach. So I'm going to skip these and straight away come to my concluding slide, okay, which tells you the 10 steps that are important to implement the event study. Okay, and this is cited from a paper by Williams and McWilliams. So step 1, define the event window. Okay, define the event, sorry, that is essentially introduction of a new information in the market. It has to be exogenous and unanticipated. Step 2, you need to outline a theory that justifies a financial response to this new information. Okay, so you cannot just consider any event. There has to be a theory behind it. For example, if we consider dividend from the corporate finance theory, we know that the dividend announcement affects the stock prices, right? Because it affects the valuation of the firm. So any free cash essentially has to be adjusted in the future valuation of the firm, and that's why they have the effect on the prices. So you should have a solid theory from the finance to justify the use of the event. Okay. Step 3, identify a sample of firms that experience this event, okay, and identify the corresponding dates with respect to these events. Okay, so suppose we are considering the dividend announcement, then with respect to every firm, these dates will vary, right? So event study has to be done. The estimation of the abnormal return has to be done at every firm level. So because the dates are different, event could be same, but the dates are different. Step 4, you need to choose an appropriate event window and justify its length, why you are considering 10 days versus 5 days, like that. Okay, if it exceeds 2 days, then typically instantaneous is 2 days around the event. Anything beyond 2 days, you need to have a justification for that. Fifth step is essentially eliminate or adjust the forms in the sample that experience the other relevant events during the event window. So it's called the sample cleaning, right? So you don't want the results to be affected by the other events. You want to have a pure event study analysis where the effect, any effect on the abnormal return has to be due to the particular event. So you need to make sure that there are no overlapping events for the sample of firms that you have considered. Step 6 is, once you have prepared your sample, cleaned it up for the genuine events, you need to compute the abnormal returns during the event window and then test their significance using parametric or non-parametric tests, whichever is justified. Then report essentially the percentage of the negative returns and the binomial returns, right? Binomial Z statistic or the Wilcoxon test statistics, that is a non-parametric test statistics. Okay, so you need to, you can report the percentage or you can also plot it. Okay. For the small samples, typically people use the bootstrap methods, okay, to come up with the test statistics and to take into account the effects of the outliers if you have a very small sample. But I wouldn't recommend that.
Could you please tell bootstrap method? What is bootstrap?
bootstrapping is essentially, the problem arises that if you have a large sample, then because of the central limit theorem, the mean, the sample mean and the sample variance would be close to essentially the normal distribution, right? Describing the normal distribution. But if you have a very small
But
sample,
for greater than 30, you are talking of that 30 some, more than 30 companies. Then there is no
yes.
problem.
No, there is no problem. Okay. For very small sample, but if your event is interesting, then instead of assuming the normal distribution, you need to create a distribution using, and that's a bootstrap method. There are standard bootstrap methods that take into account essentially the identification of the distribution. And then you can apply the non-parametric test. That's not okay, but you have to justify that. Then finally, outline a theory that explains the cross-sectional variation in the abnormal return that you see, right? Relate it with the theory, justify it, explain it, interpret it, and then you test this theory. So when you test for the significance, essentially you provide the test for the theory, okay? And then finally, you can choose to report the names of the firms and the event dates in the data appendix. You should always report that what are these dates that you have considered. Okay, these are the standard methods or the steps that we follow using the event study. And now I'll take the questions and have the discussions. Now, this is essentially the background. Okay, in the next session, I will discuss some of the papers to walk you through, how these steps are being utilized in those papers when they conduct an event study analysis. So thank you for your time, and I can take the questions. So how do I?
Yes, participant can raise questions right now.
Yeah. So I can stop sharing and.
This actually things are very much clear. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, can I speak?
Only thing is, I want to see practically how the paper is, attempted, and if you can get some data and solve it for us. Also, which software you're going to use tomorrow, please let us know.
Okay. Now I'm not sure whether, as I said earlier, the Stata has a module on the event study, so you can actually explore that. Okay. Then the data is very straightforward. Data is the stock prices. So once you have the stock prices, all you have to do is forecast the expected returns and take the difference from the observed returns over a event window and accumulate it, right? So if you have access to Stata, you can actually explore the module on the event study analysis. It's fairly straightforward. All you have to do is feed in the data, and they have the set steps. All you have to do is run the steps. They will calculate essentially the abnormal return, that they will essentially calculate the normal returns and then the abnormal returns, and also allow you to calculate the cumulative abnormal return and run the statistics. So when I say module in the Stata, they have all the standard tests, both parametric as well as the non-parametric tests. So Stata is a very standard module software that we use for the event study analysis. You can use SAS also if you have access to SAS. So to answer your question about the data analysis, showing the data analysis, I don't know if everybody has the access to this data, and then we can do the essentially the practical class. But to take that into account, what I can show you is, actually walk you through some of the papers where all these steps are clearly highlighted. Okay, so I can actually show you how it is being done. So rest of the things is essentially, running the simple OLS regression using the market model. So I don't know whether, if you have access to Stata, yes, I would be happy to take that session, but I think that is probably a little bit beyond the scope, because I was told that not everyone has the access to the same software. So if you are not able to do that, then I don't know how we can do the thing. So probably in the next class you can explore this module, the Stata module, and I can pick some questions on that as well.
Ma'am,
Yes.
Ma'am, in the next class, there will not be any hands-on session, isn't it? We will be walking through the just the papers actually, isn't that?
If you have access to data, we can have a hands-on session. I have no issues. But walking through papers, it itself is hands-on session because when you start by looking at the data that the paper has used, it is kind of hands-on. Right now, what we covered is essentially the mathematical expression and the theory behind it. So when I walk you through the papers, like for example, any paper on the dividend announcement, then I'll exactly tell you what is the sample, how that data is being organized, and how those regressions have been run, right? So I'll actually talk about the entire
Mechanism.
methodology. Yes, so that is kind of that is hands-on, because that way we will be able to cover the one of some major event study papers, right? That you will have to go through if you want to do anything in this area. So what I will do is I'll probably make it easy for you to understand these papers beforehand. Then it's a simple collection of the data, and I'll show you the data. I have the data, but it's ultimately, you see that you need to understand that if the data is a time series data, then how do you run the regressions? When you run the regressions, how do you calculate the test statistics? Right now, all the expressions are there, but then putting everything together, right? So you'll have the data, you'll have the sample, how that sample is chosen, right? That all we will cover in the next class by walking through these papers. The only limitation I have is that I suppose that not everybody may not have access to data and the data that I will ask you to collect. That is the problem that we have. But we'll try. I'll make the next session as useful as possible, because when you actually walk through the papers, you know exactly that how that data is selected, so you can visualize everything properly.
Sure, ma'am.
Ma'am, I had a
Ekta, I
doubt.
have a question. Can I?
Yes, Anita ma'am, please continue.
Okay. I had a query. When we are looking at the pre-event and post-event, when you do not have enough of evidences in the pre-event, then in such case, could we conduct event study? How much is the minimum time period that you look at from a perspective? Say, for instance, my area of research is microfinance. So in that, there is a concept of transformation of some of these institutions from, say, NGO to NBFC MFIs. So in that case, prior to, say, 2011, there was an event wherein the regulatory body has announced, RBI has announced certain norms for NBFC MFIs. So that is post-regulatory. I thought of conducting some studies on that, but there is no data that's available pre-2011 because there was no body which was collecting the information and giving. And then I thought of the second event was that, transformation, pre-transformation and post-transformation. So pre-transformation as an NGO, they do not have enough of data which is captured.
So this pre-transmission, when you say, then is it an announcement on a particular day?
Yeah, it is an announcement, right?
It is an announcement, yes. So yes, so event study. Yeah, so whatever, once you have identified the event, I must tell you that, in finance and corporate finance, event study is a data extensive analysis. So if you do not have the information, there is no way you can actually predict the normal performance of the stock returns of the companies that are, expected to be affected by these events. So
by the way, they are not listed companies.
Then you cannot carry out an event study analysis, because the whole idea of event study analysis is that how the market reacts, because the prices in the stock market, in the capital market, in the financial market are able to incorporate the new information in terms of the change in the valuation followed by the price. So that is the whole idea about the event study. So the underlying assumption in the event study is that the stock prices are incorporating this the information that is being introduced through the event, right? So now if you do not have the firms which are being traded, then it is a standard the economic analysis where you have to see, then event study is not fit. You have to see a more of a sort of economic analysis, that if these changes in the regulation are likely to affect the behavior of the firm, right, which will ultimately kind of alter the valuation of these firms and their future strategies and future valuation, stuff like that, or the focus group that you want to consider. So then it is more of an economic analysis. Then the event study is not applicable in that case.
So according to you, if an event study has to be conducted on the impact of a specific firm-specific event on the stock market, is it? Otherwise, you do not call it as event study now?
So one way is the firm-specific event. The other one is if you have macroeconomic event, but that is also affecting a set of firms. For example, there was a Companies Act, right, which announced that every firm has to have one woman in their board, right? Now that announcement is affecting all the firms in the market because that was made mandatory for all the listed firms. So now that is justified theoretically that, that will change the board structure and ultimately it will have effect on the valuation of the firms. Now the idea is that how quickly the market absorbs this information by incorporating the change, the perceived and anticipated change in future with respect to the firms which may not have any woman director compared to the firm which are already having a woman director. Then I have a clear case, right? I have a benchmark group that there are firms who are already having a woman director. They are not affected by this event. Then I have the control group which are not having any woman director. They will be straight away affected by this particular announcement, right? So it is not necessarily the firm specific announcement, but it affects the firms in the market. Okay, so for these two sets of events, you can conduct an event study analysis. And yes, you need to have,
I have to relook at the definition of an event.
Yes, so that is the first slide. That is the first slide that define the event properly, and then it has, that event has to have an effect, right? If you perceive, then it has to have an effect, as in if the event was not in the place, it might have had no impact, right? But because of the event, there is an impact.
Right. In that case, I have seen the transformed NGO, which was around probably 1 to 10 crores, less than 10 crores. Now, post-transformation, it has reached 100 crores plus. Now, why I don't call it as an event in that case? Right. It has impacted the firm, and over a period of time, the firm has grown and had
so that is a new equilibrium. That is a new equilibrium. The event study we conduct for, the short term market reaction. Okay, so eventually what you're talking about, there is a new equilibrium that the firm value has increased, right? The value of NGO has increased. Fair enough. That's the effect of the regulation. I totally agree with you, right?
Not regulation, it's a transformation.
Okay, it's a transformation. So whatever is imposed on them, right? And then they are forced to transform whatever. I am not an expert in microfinance, but all I'm saying is that there is an external force which required or which prompted a transformation which took them from, say, 10 crore to 100 crore, right? Now, the event study comes into the picture. I have a slide, right, on the short-term horizon and a long-term horizon. Now, the short-term horizon argues basically that there is a new equilibrium which is, which comes eventually, but the way the market goes to that new equilibrium is the event study analysis. Okay, how the market reacts, how fast it goes to that new equilibrium, that is essentially the event study. And that is why, how will you define the event window? Whether this 10 crore to 100 crore has happened in 2 days or 5 years or 10 years, right? You need to have that window, and it cannot be like, a very long horizon, because then there are other things that are playing a role, right, in affecting essentially the core of any firm. Now, another thing that I want to tell you is, when we do the event study, the event studies are more applicable when there is a market valuation of the firms. Okay? Because this is the instantaneous reaction that we are able to capture. If you are worried about what is the long-term effect on any say policy or any event for that matter, right, then more conventional economic studies would be helpful, because it may not be really instantaneous that is playing a role. It could be actually a very long-term effect, right? So that's where you have to be extremely careful about applying the event study. So event study cannot be applied anywhere and everywhere. So you have to have a clear theoretical backing that why this will impose a short-term change or an instantaneous change in the prices, which will be captured by the market.
Thank you
So
so
now
much.
mostly it has to be the listed firm. If you do not have the trading data, then I would worry about how to predict the normal performance, right? Then what is that normal performance that we should predict? It's not the value, right? It's the prices that we are talking about. Yes, next, please.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am, can budget announcements be considered as events which are specific, say, favoring one particular industry?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, that was my question.
Absolutely.
Because you generally
Absolutely.
showed events in terms of corporate actions in the slide which you
Macroeconomic, yes. So any
yeah.
macroeconomic
Yes,
variable, yes, of course. I said that macroeconomic variables are also events. Yeah,
and to add
absolutely.
on, yes, in that case, to add on to a question posed by somebody about COVID, because we attempted one paper on event study based on budget of 2021, whether it was favoring the pharma sector and infrastructure sector, because there were certain announcements which were favoring the pharmaceutical sector in terms of more funds being allocated to those sectors, and the results were also really encouraging in the sense that in the short run, that is in the we took a window of 6 days, and in those 6 days the prices really increased drastically, and then they reached a new equilibrium, as you mentioned. So when
Okay,
you
that's
said,
very interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
of
because
course.
when somebody asked about COVID study, I thought this would be a valid point, because COVID, you said we cannot take
Yeah.
it as a event. Yes. So, but
Uh,
budget after COVID.
But yes, but during the COVID time, any new announcement can be an event. Yes.
Yes. And ma'am, one more thing I
Because
would
you are
want.
also, just one point I want to make, this is a very good question, because what you are predicting the normal performance also during the COVID period. It is not the before COVID period, right? So it is
Yes.
that estimation window also falls under the COVID time. So then
Yeah.
yes, it is a perfect setup for an event study.
And
And I
what
should
we did, ma'am,
congratulate you.
just
Yes.
thank you, ma'am. We sent the paper to IIM. I don't know for what reason it got rejected for the conference. Doesn't matter, ma'am. One more thing I just wanted to add is the estimation window, because we thought that it should be a normal duration, and just before 2021 budget, it was abnormalcy in the sense that market had fallen and then it was rising at a very fast pace. So we took the estimation period not as 1 year, but more than 1 year, so that it would become more, the normal returns would become, it would be real normal returns rather than, that the,
There's no real normal returns.
yeah,
You
yeah, I
have
know.
to have You have to have an estimation window which is not confounded by any other events. So if your estimation window has a period of COVID or the introduction of COVID around those times, then your event study will not be
No, ma'am, that
meaningful.
is the reason we prolonged the estimation window. We took the period before onset of COVID, that is before March 2020.
But you are taking, when is your event?
Ma'am, event is March 2021.
Yes. So then what you are saying is, then you are actually, there are overlapping time periods, right? So there could be also your entire estimation window is corrupted due to the COVID period also, right? So you need to have, either you focus on only do, if you are saying that everything is in 2021, the announcement is happening, then you say that you have to have that 1 year is a reasonable time period, 150 days to 200 days. We don't
Yes, ma'am.
usually go beyond it, because then it will be confounded with many other events or the scenarios which we may not be aware of. And if you exceed your event window beyond March 2020, estimation window before March 2020, then it is clearly the time period where the COVID was setting in the financial market. So the information about COVID was already there, right? So you have to be selective. You have to choose the estimation window which is normal, in that sense that there is no abnormality macroeconomically also, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So
Yes,
that
ma'am.
is, you can actually try reducing your event estimation window and see how it goes.
Ma'am, is it essential that our estimation window should be till T0? I mean, or
No,
can
no,
there
no, no,
not necessary?
no, please pay attention to the timeline. I clearly said that 0 is the event window.
No, minor. Yes, ma'am.
Tau 1, right? So 0 is the event date. Tau 1, right? Or say T1 to T2 is the event window. Then the estimation window is even beyond T1. Even there is a gap
Ma'am, I
between
got,
T1.
ma'am,
Yes.
if I can explain my point, I got your point. Say my event window was March of 2021. Easy. Is it necessary that my estimation window should be till the end of February, or can it be till January also? Can I have a gap in between?
Yes, you can have a gap in between.
Yeah, ma'am. That was my question, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thanks for your question.
Any more question? Ma'am, I have a question. Can we use this event study methodology for IPO valuation? Recently, Zomato IPO, and there was a paid promotion things and all this. 9,000 crores
Yes.
company has overvalued to 90,000 crores. Some kind
Yes,
of behavior, yeah.
you
So-
can use it for the IPO valuations. Absolutely.
Okay. So if there are multiple events which have impacted for this IPO valuation, how we can capture this effect?
Yeah, so the multiple events is, you have to essentially be careful about the clustering of these events, right? So you have to adjust, essentially when you are calculating the test statistics, you have to bring in the clustering into the picture. That's
Some kind of behavioral influences also with this kind of thing. Can we capture that also? Can we include this?
behavior as in, see, the event study is essentially you have a price, right? So anything which is intrinsic to the market will be captured in terms of the normal performance, because the behavioral issues will also remain same, right, even before the event. So that's kind of uniform.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks a lot. So any more questions? If no questions, we can wind up the session. Any questions from the participants? You can ask right now.
So I have few chat messages, so I hope that I've answered.
Yeah, as many of them were
Yeah.
addressed. And one question: if it is a macroeconomic event, how do we choose the treatment group and control group? I think.
Yeah, so the macroeconomic event is essentially, the control and treatment group is, say, sample of firms. So there could be some firms which are affected by that macroeconomic event versus the other ones who are not affected. If you can highlight that, then it's a control and treatment group. Otherwise, it's all a sample of firms where, if everybody is affected, then you can say that, as a result of this economic event, this is the abnormal, this is the extent of the abnormal returns in the market. So you can generalize that also. So the control and treatment group has to be if there is, a certain set of firms which are not affected by that particular event. So you have to describe what kind of economic, macroeconomic event that you are considering. Okay. So then you can have a treatment and control group. Otherwise, you can have a same sample, right? You can have a common sample, and then you can say that what is the effect of the macroeconomic event. Event study can also be utilized for that. Yes.
Okay. So hope there is no more questions. So I would like to extend my sincere thanks to ma'am for the wonderful session delivered, and we will have the further discussions on this event study methodology. Exactly, ma'am pointed out the essentialities, the requirement of doing these things that will be delivered Friday. Friday we will have another session on event study methodology, and that will discuss the papers based on event study methodology, and the methodology would be discussed in detail, and that will be helpful for detailed analysis. If you have this data, and because a lot of the participants are not able to access this data because it is a paid platform, so that this kind of analytics, it will be available in the YouTube and all, so you can study the theoretical and the data methodology part in detail, then you can apply it in the later part. Okay. So ma'am will be available future workshops conducted by our department. So I thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture delivered here. So we will meet
Thank you,
again.
Dr. Biju.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you for your time today, and I hope this was useful, and we will meet again. So hopefully I will be able to clear more doubts in the next session. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. So we are winding up right now, and we will start tomorrow 10 o'clock with another session. Vijay Mohan session to be continued. Okay, thank you all. Thank you all.